Hey, have you seen I Saw the TV Glow? It's a new movie on Max. It was actually the second most popular movie in very recent history. It was made in 2024, and there's a lot of chatter about it. So what I wanted to do, I watched the movie. I'm going to give a little bit of a summary of what the movie's about. We're not going to go beat by beat. I don't want to spoil everything. Then I'm going to do the review, talk about the good and the bad from the movie, and then get into some deeper stuff about what the movie is saying and what it really means for us as viewers and for the filmmaker. So this might have been one where I needed to write a much more detailed script for this, but we'll see how it turns out by the end here. So I Saw the TV Glow. Anybody who has seen the cover of this movie, they saw the very distinctive neon pink that was alluring to me. It was alluring when I saw it on the list of movies that you can watch on Max. It was something that stuck out. It looked a tiny bit amateurish when it came to the design. It made me think of Poltergeist and the iconic ideas that came out of that. But I thought it was more of an update on a lot of those ideas. I thought maybe it'd be a socio-cultural criticism based on the media that we take in today, but it became something else. It is described as two teenagers bond over their love of a supernatural TV show, but it is mysteriously canceled. Directed by Jane Schoenbrun. The writer is also Jane Schoenbrun. And it's starring Justice Smith, Brigette, Lundy-Paine, and Ian Foreman. The last of which is the kid. He plays the kid version of the main character. But honestly, it makes sense to give him billing because there are very few characters in this movie, which is significant and will come up later. So the movie is about this kid who will later be played by Justice Smith, the older version of it, but started out, it's Ian Foreman playing the character. And as child actors go, he's not great, but he's not terrible. He meets Brigette Lundy-Paine, and they have a bit of a talk about this TV show that they're interested in. And he decides that he's going to tell his parents that he's going over to a friend's house for a sleepover on Saturdays when the show is playing, but secretly sneak off to Bridget's place where they're going to watch this TV show. And the show has this very significant impact on both the characters, so they talk about it all the time, they think about it all the time. Like I said, it could have been a setup for some criticism of the way that we imbibe media like this, but it did not turn out to be that. She has a friend at the time. We don't see the friend again, but it's this show. And the show is about these younger female characters who are going through these supernatural things and overcoming these supernatural villains, including a character that's called Mr. Melancholy, which is certainly on the nose. And so that is the setup. And then over time, you see that their individual experiences with their families will interfere with their interest in the show, and that will have psychological and emotional ramifications at a certain point. And I'm just going to give a little bit more plot so you understand how this whole thing works, but I'm not going to go into details about what happens hereafter because it actually is significant to have these revelations as you come through the movie. Because initially when you're watching it, it is incredibly childish, the way that the show is designed and the way that a lot of the characters talk, and you wonder what's going on here. But for me, it was so childish that I knew there had to be something else going on, so I wanted to keep watching it and see where it was going. But later, the female character, the Brigette character, or the character that's played by Brigette, she goes to the older Justice Smith character and says that she has been abused by her stepfather and is going to run away. She has to get out of there. But that means, as is indicated by Justice Smith's character, he says that, well, that'll mean that he won't be able to watch the show anymore, so she shouldn't leave. She suggests that he come with her. They both run away together. They go find somewhere to be. They can keep watching their show, and they can just figure things out from there. He initially agrees, but when it comes down to the day, he decides that it's just not something that he can do, and he returns to his family and tells them about how he had been sneaking away to go watch the show. Okay, so that's enough setup, and it doesn't spoil the important things related to the storyline. So we'll do the mechanical stuff first and then the deeper stuff. So mechanically, the writing is relatively amateurish when it comes to a lot of the dialogue and the setups and the way the plot is broken down. But there is a lot of heart and sincerity in the way that it's structured. So one thing that's really, really frustrating is that there are a lot of times where characters are just describing things as having happened, and it goes on for a while where they're just talking about this. You know, obviously there's the old adage about filmmaking, show don't tell. there's a whole hell of a lot of telling. Now, there's some reason for this within the logic of the movie itself, but it gets really, really tedious. And this is not helped out by the fact that the actress, Brigette Lundy-Paine, is not very good at just conveying pathos and subtext and complexity and what she's trying to get across. It's mostly really superficial emotional representations. And both of the actors who are playing here, generally they're just kind of morose and walk around morose. And again, that makes some sense within the logic of the movie and what's actually going on metaphorically. But still, it gets tedious watching these two characters just acting the same way all the time. With the female character, she'll occasionally have these emotional outbursts, but they're really superficial outbursts. And then she has to give these very lengthy monologues where she just does not have the acting chops to be able to give gravitas or meaning to these things. It makes me want to compare it to Inherent Vice, and it's not really fair to compare it to Paul Thomas Anderson, but I think I'm going to do it a couple of times within this review. Inherent Vice, at the end of it, there's a moment where one of the characters, a female character, has to give this very lengthy monologue that kind of summarizes the thematics of the movie. And she has to be able to hold your attention throughout this entire monologue and it not become cheap or uninteresting or something that could have been better done by showing you something instead of her having to say it. But she does it. There are other subtextual things about the encounter where there's this buildup of tension. She's giving the monologue to Joaquin Phoenix. And so there's a sexual tension between them that's building up. And there are all these things that have already happened. And that movie's by no means perfect or anything like that. It's not like a lot of his other movies. But she is able to do that because she has those contextually within the kind of movie it is, that new kind of noir. There's more going on in the movie in general, but it's also that she is a legitimate actress who can sell this thing. And when you don't have that, it just becomes, it takes forever in this movie and it's tedious and you wish that they would have found a much more creative way to get across these ideas than her just expressing these things while these lights go over her face. So that, in the first instance, was frustrating. One good thing about it, though, was that the director made sure to splash any of the environments with neon light, and it happened in most of the scenes, which was a nice touch. It gave it a cinematographic through line that you got to look forward to and made it seem like its own thing, which I really appreciated. It also makes sense for the thematics that you later find out why that was the case. So I appreciated that. That was great. It looked fine. There was nothing that was just glaring about how the shots were framed or how the cinematography was done. Everybody seemed to be giving their all, at least, and believe in the project to some degree. But there were other movies that I want to and that's the thing. So when it comes to the tone and genre of this movie, you could compare it a couple of different ways. And there are ways to compare it to things like Licorice Pizza, where you have this look into adolescence at this point and what it means, and within the space that they're in, how it affects them and what they want to do and what they try to accomplish and the obstacles that they run into. Licorice Pizza does that. It's Paul Thomas Anderson again. And it has this beautiful vibe. It's also a period movie, so that's why it's a more apt comparison. It has this beautiful vibe. It has these kids who are going through things, this duo, and a lot of different things happen. They have different meanings to each of them, and it really has this soft and beautiful production that feels like it's captured in time, you know? In this one, it was more jagged in the way that it was done, and there are more supernatural elements, obviously, to this, so it gets a little bit of leeway when it comes to that. But for the most part, there's some wood paneling, and there are the VHSs, but tonally, it doesn't really have a grasp on what it needs to be and where it needs to hold itself for the duration. It's difficult to explain without going directly into all the details related to the movie. But there are other good things about it, and those will come out more when we detail the specifics about the ideas behind it. And to be able to do that, you do have to know more about the filmmaker. So this all ties in. One of the things that you notice is that none of the characters outside of the main character have much of a personality or significance at all. It is one of the most childishly superficial written movies that I've seen in a very long time. Now, in most cases, this would be due to a failing of the writer and the filmmaker, but I don't think this filmmaker would say that it's a detriment to be this narcissistic. So when it comes to like the father character and the characters that he meets at work, the characters that he meets at this birthday party, the mother character, even his female counterpart, none of them actually have personalities or have interests of their own or have arcs of their own or anything like that. They're all just ornaments to the narcissism of the main character, which makes it incredibly superficial. As a side note, and this is not something that bothers me anymore, I just expect it. It is funny that all the white male characters are the bad people. So you have the one character who's the father character, and he says, that show's for girls, and it's supposed to be, a villainous thing for him to say. And then you have another white male character who's bullying the main character at his job. But again, none of them have any real personalities. None of them have any arcs or much of anything to do or say. Every character in this, apart from the main character, is very, very limited. And some of them have, one scene. The mother character has hardly anything to do. She has a couple of lines and that's it. And that is just par for the course of the writing. But the thing that ought to be known about the filmmaker is transgender, and I don't know what the actual empirically reflective pronouns ought to be in this particular case. Her name's Jane. I'm going to call her Jane. On the Wikipedia page, it said something about they pronouns. I'm not going down any of those lines. I don't care. But the filmmaker talked about her struggles with her family. And like I said, whatever the empirically correct pronouns are, just substitute those for whatever I'm saying. So she has a lot of estrangement from her family, and this was one of the major motivators related to this movie. Identifies as non-binary. So as we go on in the movie, I didn't know any of this before I saw it, but it's pretty clear as you go through the movie. There is at least one scene that's very obvious and explicit. At one point, one of the characters, the girl character, asks the guy, Justice Smith's character, whether he likes girls. And he says, I don't know, I just like TV. So that was the first instance, and yeah, you could pretty much run with that anyway when it comes to thematics. But it gets more explicit as they go on when it comes to the TV show and how they relate to the TV show. And at a certain point, they're having another conversation, and she's asking him whether he really remembers the TV show in the right way, what actually happened when he was watching it. And that gives there's a more obvious, explicit representation that it's about that trans experience. And this is kind of where the movie redeems itself. Like I said, I would see this as a moral failing, and most people would in most instances, that it's so narcissistic. But the filmmaker certainly wouldn't. She would see it as something that's just honest. And there's something to be said for that perspective. Because to me, when I was watching the movie, it definitely struck me as something that was sincere, that was honest, that was trying to express a novel emotion that people have in a way that was as accurate as possible. Now, transgenderism is an affliction of severe narcissism. So to have that be reflected in a movie in an effective way, there's a novelty to that. That's a new kind of a story. Now, there were a number of things about the motivations of the central characters. You call them characters, but they're not really. It's really just the central character and everybody else who reflects something about the central character or is a foil for them. Like the show itself, if you're talking about the mechanics of storytelling, it should have been a really interesting show so you could see how somebody could be totally sucked in and be really interested in the show, and therefore, as a result, it's something that's really important to them. That to the point that if they don't get to see it or if their parents prevent them from seeing it, then they have to find a way to see it. The show, as it's depicted within the movie, is pretty damn stupid. It's really, really dumb. It's poorly made. It doesn't make any sense. And all the writing has them talking about how great the show is and how much it means to them and all that without them really reflecting it. Now, as far as I know, there was actually an inspiration from Buffy the Vampire Slayer for the show within the movie. Which is understandable. I have not seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer in that way. I've seen a few episodes. But I can understand that metaphorically, as far as I know, was taking on being a teenager and going to high school, and it was metaphorically representing trying to deal with all the kinds of difficulties that teenagers have. So it would be represented as something supernatural. There'd be this monster or that monster that she has to overcome. But in reality, it was about those emotions that teenagers have to go through when they're growing up. So this, in a similar vein, is trying to represent the emotions that are related to being transgender. And as far as was described somewhat by the filmmaker, there was something about televisions and looking into televisions and seeing yourself being depicted to the world, but knowing internally, like you being sitting there, being the viewer of the television, that that's not really you. And you have this horror moment, this is where the horror comes from, where you realize finally, and they call it, which is I think a really interesting phrase, they call it an egg crack moment, that there's this moment that you realize that's not you and you don't realize who you really are. So now you have to go through this process after this thing has been completely undermined, everything you thought you were. You have this egg crack moment, and now you've got to figure out everything from here. You know, the entirety of existence has been just shredded beneath you, and now you have to know what you are. So that would be a terrifying thing emotionally. Now, the thing that transgender people don't realize is that everybody goes through that at some point. They feel that they don't feel right in their own bodies. They don't understand why people of the opposite sex are treating them in particular ways versus other ways. They don't understand that when you have this incredible love one day and then it'll completely be disastrous the next day, or that you have these problems with your parents that they don't accept you, and it doesn't have to be about gender, it doesn't have to be about sexuality. It can just be about what you want to do with your future, or how you talk to each other, or who you are friends with. All of those things happen to everybody. But it doesn't change the validity of the artistic expression of this feeling within this context. So there are other things like the female character talks about abuse, and that being the catalyst for her trying to get away. Whereas the main character doesn't express anything like that, but is still so severely afflicted by not being able to watch this TV show that he is considering running away from home as a result, and not even having to go that far, just the emotional upheaval and the horror that is experienced by this character. You would expect there to be more things that he has to run away from than simply, oh, Dad doesn't want me to watch this show. Now, of course, there could be the metaphorical interpretation that really it's a representation of all the rejection and resentment and everything else that he has to feel. And so it's something bigger within the metaphorical context than it is within the plot direct context. So, I mean, you can make that argument fine, but still you have this emotional thing. And this is another thing. Of course, we talked about Men, and Mother had a very similar issue where you have the metaphor that overtakes any storytelling too early on, and so you don't have that for the rest of the movie. But within this movie, it actually does a good job of this, where it has its own story for a good amount of time, for plenty of time to get you to the point of accepting that now it's transitioning into the supernatural metaphor aspect of the story. It actually does that part well. And it does it better than movies like Men that just dive right into the metaphor ahead of time. So again, there are no other characters within this movie, and the central character comes off as so childish and narcissistic, it becomes annoying. But once you get what's being said and the sincerity behind it, then you kind of appreciate where the movie's going and where it's been, and it has enough of head-scratching moments that you can appreciate those too. Now, I didn't know this before I started the review, but when I looked up the IMDb page, it did give a little blurb about critics and where they scored it, and it is dramatically oversold on that, but that's what you'd expect because of just the subject matter. It definitely does not deserve that score. But whatever the case, it does have some ideas as you go forward that are representative of what it means to be transgender, and it has this world of symbolism that I think makes some genuine sense of what it could feel like, and some visuals that are at least interesting, even though they often verge on cartoonish. But even some of the dream-like sequences where it shows like this villain, this representation of this villain, I think they were done reasonably well. There's some CG in there that doesn't look quite right, but I think the design of it, they could have gone something really mundane or stupid, but I think that it was pretty decent for what they had and what they were trying to depict. And then you have the ending, and the thing to keep in mind without going into big spoiler territory by just explicitly saying what happens and what it means, what you need to think about is that twice this particular character, the central character, ran away from something that was terrifying, but could have also been very liberating. Now, in the context of transgenderism, of course, you can guess what that is. And there are some liberties taken as a director toward the end of the movie that I think are a little goofy and a little too much, especially since they're essentially depicting the same thing. But there also is this idea of time dilation, wherein time doesn't feel the same when you are one person versus the person that you think you should be. So you get this span of time, and there's this representation of the progression of time and how it really messes with you. So there's just some of that going on toward the end. And one thing that the director made sure to do was they had an effeminate male play the main character and a masculine female, who even has a bit of a mustache as far as I can tell, play the other character. So there was already that balance going on from the beginning of the movie. So anyway, yeah, like I said, it's definitely seemingly what a child would write if they were writing a movie. It's extremely narcissistic, self-centered. It has no interests and no ideas to express about the world. The only thing that it's interested in is what emotional upheaval it is going through. That's the only thing that it has an interest in. But to some degree, I think that's okay. I mean, it's not good when it comes to morality and emotional maturity and understanding of the world or anything like that. But it is an artistic expression of a new emotion. It's something that is genuine to today and significant. And I think it's true to form of what this person actually feels trying to depict something that is really opaque and difficult to describe. I think it's really just does justice to that idea. So that being the case, I mean, even though I might not agree with it, and think that there are a bunch of histrionics and childishness that's built into it. Yeah, guess what? That's what humans are. That's what human emotions do. Like, that's what art often tries to depict when you have anybody who's expressing something selfish or solipsistic or primal or anything else. That's what art does. So I think I can appreciate something that adds something to the zeitgeist. It's definitely much more interesting than the 4,000th version of fake virtue coming out of Disney, just so they can do a cash grab. Like, this kind of a thing isn't a cash grab. This is a genuine attempt at expression. So I can appreciate that. Anyway, yeah, that is I Saw the TV Glow. If anybody wants to do like a full-on spoiler talk where we go beat by beat through the movie and talk about the explicit things that happen within the story and what they're likely to mean and how well they depict or don't depict the emotions behind it or the ideas behind it, then let me know. But otherwise, yeah, that was that movie, and that's it for today. All right, I'll see you. Bye.